8 omens are recorded predating the arrival of the Spanish in the Americas. These omens caused fear and panic throughout the lands. The first of which was the tongue of flame. 10 years before the first Spanish sail broke the horizon, a massive, glowing anomaly appeared suspended in the night sky. Rising in the east just after midnight, it took the shape of a brilliant tongue of fire, wide at its base and tapering to a sharp point that seemed to stretch into the center of the heavens. It burned so intensely that it lit the darkness like the daytime, lingering until the morning, where it would be replaced by the morning sun. This wasn't a brief event. It returned every single night for a full year. The sight caused mass panic. Whenever the flame appeared, the population shouted in terror, entirely convinced that the blinding light was a warning of an approaching catastrophe. The second omen struck one of the temples. Without warning, the temple's ornamented wooden pillars spontaneously caught fire, with the flames appearing to erupt directly from deep inside the wood itself. Desperate priests shouted for the citizens to bring jars of water to save the structure, but their efforts only made it worse. When they threw water onto the blaze, the fire flared up even hotter, completely reducing the temple to embers. The third omen targeted a thatched roof temple of the god of fire. It was suddenly struck by a bolt of lightning, deeply shocking the people because there was no storm, only a light drizzle. Strangest of all, the strike was entirely silent. There was no thunder whatsoever, leaving the witnesses completely baffled as to how the temple suddenly caught fire. The fourth omen occurred in broad daylight. While the sun was shining, a comet fell, manifesting as three bright stars streaking across the sky in parallel. They shot from the west to the east, dragging large tails and throwing off sparks as they moved. The moment the people saw these daylight comets, they erupted into a massive outcry, sending a loud uproar echoing through the entire district. The fifth omen struck the lake surrounding the city. Without warning, the water swelled into massive waves and appeared to boil. This was completely unnatural as the lake never rose without strong winds, yet the air was totally still. The surging water pushed far inland, crashing into the houses and shaking their foundations so violently that several buildings collapsed. The sight of this wild, windless flood left the people in absolute terror. The sixth omen came as a disembodied voice echoing in the night air. The people heard a woman crying out in despair, mourning that her children were about to be lost. At other times, her voice would ring through the dark, desperately asking where she was supposed to take them. The seventh omen occurred just after midday when waterfowl hunters captured a dark bird the size of a crane. They brought the creature to Moctezuma. In the center of the bird's head was a round mirror. When the emperor looked into it, he was frightened. He saw a reflection of the night sky and its constellations. But when he looked into the mirror a second time, these stars were replaced by a vision of a massive armed multitude moving together on horseback. He immediately summoned his priests, demanding to know the meaning of this approaching army. But before the seers could even give an answer, the bird completely vanished, leaving them in silence. The eighth and final omen involved the repeated appearance of beings with monstrous bodies. These monsters were captured and brought directly to the emperor at his lodging. But immediately after the emperor had looked at them, the creatures would disappear, just as the bird before them. The physical reality of the omens finally arrived on the coast when strange ships appeared on the horizon. Montezuma's coastal captains immediately went to investigate. The scouting party was led by a captain named Pinotto. He gathered other regional captains along with two lower-level leaders. Together, this small delegation hurried to the shore to witness exactly what had arrived in their waters. To safely investigate the mysterious vessels, the 5 men used trade as cover. They brought with them highly exclusive, intricately designed cloaks, garments so restricted that only the emperor himself had permission to wear them. As they rowed their canoes out toward the ships, they agreed they needed to see exactly what was happening so they could carry a true report back to the emperor himself. But when they drew close and actually laid eyes on the Spaniards, the scouts kissed the prows of their canoes in a gesture of worship. They believed they were witnessing the long-awaited return of the god, Quetzalcoatl. The Spaniards called out, demanding to know where the men were from and who ruled them. The scouts answered that they came from Mexico and served Moctezuma. They then presented the fleet's leader, a man they noted as Grijalva, with the emperor's royal cloaks. In return, the Spaniards handed the scouts green and yellow glass beads. The indigenous men were utterly amazed by the unfamiliar objects. They valued them highly. But before sailing away, the Spaniards announced they were returning to the castle and promised they would soon come back and march to Mexico. Traveling a day and a night without stopping, the scouts rushed back to Tenochtitlan to deliver their report. They presented the glass beads to the emperor, humbly confessing that they had given away his royal cloaks to the gods in the sea. They passed on the Spaniards' message. The beads were meant specifically for the emperor to know them. Hearing this, he told the exhausted scouts to rest, but he issued a strict, fearful command. He had received this news in secret, and they were absolutely forbidden from breathing a word of what they had seen to anyone. Following the scouts' secret report, Moctezuma immediately mobilized a massive coastal watch, ordering guards and lookouts to be stationed along the entire shoreline to watch for the strangers' return. He then gathered his highest-ranking lords, showed them the mysterious glass beads, and ordered the items locked in his treasury. He warned his inner circle that if a single bead was lost, the guards would pay with their lives, and their families would be taken. An entire year passed in tense anticipation. Finally, in the year 13 Rabbit, the lookouts spotted ships returning from the east. When word reached the emperor, he was completely convinced that the returning fleet was Quetzalcoatl coming back from the sea to reclaim his throne. In a desperate bid to appease the deity, the emperor immediately dispatched 5 high-ranking nobles to the coast, heavily burdened with magnificent divine gifts to welcome the god. When the Spanish arrived and the 5 emissaries finally boarded the Spanish flagship, they treated the commander, Hernan Cortez, as a returning deity. They carefully dressed him in the magnificent sacred regalia of their own god, adorning him in brilliant feathers, turquoise masks, and golden ornaments. But Cortez was not appeased by these sacred honors. Instead of receiving the gifts with divine grace, he coldly asked if this was all they had brought. He then ordered the Mexica messengers to be bound in iron shackles. In an attempt to completely shatter their understanding of the world, Cortez ordered his great cannon to be fired. The deafening explosion and concussive blast terrified the emissaries so deeply that they collapsed to the deck, losing consciousness. When the Spanish revived them, the encounter shifted from terrifying to violently aggressive. Cortez handed the bewildered, exhausted messengers leather shields and iron swords. He told them that he had heard rumors that the Mexico were fierce, unmatched warriors, and he commanded them to prove it. He demanded that these diplomats fight his armed men in a duel right there, on the spot. The emissaries desperately refused, explaining that the emperor had only sent them to deliver a peaceful greeting, not to wage war. However, trapped, mocked, and outmatched, they were eventually released, paddling furiously back to the capital to report that these beings were not benevolent gods, but hostile, terrifying invaders. Moctezuma made a final, fatal miscalculation. Hoping to satisfy the invaders and convince them to turn back, he sent them magnificent gifts of pure gold. But the strategy backfired completely. When the Spaniards finally laid eyes on the massive quantities of gold, the Mexica observers witnessed a horrifying transformation. The scribes recorded that the invaders did not look upon the treasure with the dignity of gods or kings. Instead, they snatched it up wildly. The Nahuatl accounts state that their faces lit up with a ravenous, swelling greed, noting that they hungered like pigs for that gold. The illusion was entirely shattered. These were not celestial beings sent to test them. They were mortal men driven by an insatiable, violent lust for wealth. While the indigenous survivors recorded this raw, visceral greed, the Spanish commander was actively writing a very different version of events. In his official letters to King Charles V of Spain, Hernan Cortes completely omitted the extortionate violence. Instead, he framed the plundering of Tenochtitlan as polite, legal collection of tribute for the Spanish crown, masking a rogue campaign of wealth extraction behind the noble language of diplomacy and Christian duty. Driven by that singular greed, the Spaniards marched on to Tenochtitlan. What followed was not a swift, supernatural judgment, but a grueling, brutal war of attrition. The Spanish gathered regional allies, and they brought with them a devastating, invisible weapon: smallpox. The glorious island city was eventually besieged and starved. It was reduced to blood-stained rubble, its temples cast down, and its population decimated by disease and famine. The empire did not fall to destiny or divine will. It fell to an overwhelming campaign of violent extraction. The Spanish conquest wasn't just a military defeat. It was the shattering of an entire world. The accounts left behind in the texts like the Florentine Codex aren't just historical records. They're the voices of survivors trying to make sense of the apocalypse. As to the truth of the omens that preceded the invasion, we leave the last word to the late leading scholar, James Lockhart. In my view, they are the typical attempt of a vanquished group to explain, after the fact, what has happened, saying that the gods were against us. We should have seen what was coming, instead of evidence of fatalism and undue superstition on the part of the indigenous people who were actually living the experience. Thank you.